Shortly after noon on Easter Monday, April 24th, 1916, Patrick Pierce stood on the steps of the General Post Office on Sackville Street, which is now O'Connell Street, in Dublin, and read to the hushed crowd the proclamation of the Republic declaring Irish independence. The proclamation contained the following words: "We hereby proclaim the Irish Republic as a sovereign independent state, and we pledge our lives and the lives of our comrades in arms to the cause of its freedom, of its welfare, and its exaltation among the nations." Thus was launched one of the most glorious failures in history, the 1916 Easter Rising. As time gets further and further away from that epic event, the names tend to blur together. However, it is crucial that they be remembered, and that their part in Ireland's fight for independence be recognized and celebrated. As W.B. Yeats writes in his poem, 1916, which we will hear later, "Our part to murmur name upon name, as a mother names her child when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild." With that in mind, the signatories of the Proclamation of 1916 are Thomas Clark. Thomas Clark was born to Irish parents on the Isle of Wight, where his British Army father was stationed. Following a short stint in South Africa, the family settled back in Ireland when Clark was 7. In 1882, he decided to emigrate to America. While living there, he became involved with the Clan Gael, a Republican organization that believed violence was justified to achieve their aims. This belief was put into sharp relief when he was sentenced to 15 years in prison for a role he played in a London bombing campaign. On his release in 1898, Clark returned to America for a spell and then came to Dublin in 1907, where he quickly became involved with the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Although he prudently kept a fairly low profile because of his criminal past, he was nevertheless an influential member of the military council that planned the rising and was the first man to sign the Proclamation of Independence. During the rising, he was stationed at the GPO, where he was vehemently opposed to the surrender. However, he was outvoted. He was executed by firing squad on May 3rd and survived by his wife, Kathleen, and 3 children. Sean McDermott was born and spent his early years in County Leitrim. In 1900, when he was 17, he moved to Glasgow and earned a living working as a tram conductor. He arrived back in England in 1902 and eventually settled in Dublin in 1908, joining the IRB and managing their newspaper, Irish Freedom. He contracted polio in 1911, which left him with a pronounced limb. However, he did not let his physical condition hold back his revolutionary agenda, and he is widely credited with rejuvenating the Irish Republican Brotherhood. After World War I broke out, he became a vocal opponent of conscription and was imprisoned under the terms of the Defense of the Realm Act. Conscription, for those of you who aren't aware, was the forced induction of mostly Irish sailors into the British Army to fight World War II and World War I. WWI, as we call it. McDermott played his cards incredibly close to his chest when it came to planning with the rising strategy, and he actively excluded a number of his compatriots in the Irish Republican Brotherhood, much to their chagrin. He was another of the signatories to suspend the rising in the General Post Office, and in the aftermath of the failed rebellion, he too was sentenced to be executed. He died by firing squad on May 12, 2016. Thomas McDonough was initially drawn to a career in the priesthood, but later settled on a career as a teacher. He was a gifted writer, dramatist, and poet, and used his creative skills to play an active role in a number of nationalistic endeavors, including the Irish Women's Franchise League. In November 1913, McDonough signed up to join the Irish Volunteers and took office as a provisional committee member. He believed that zealous martyrs were the key to Irish independence, by peaceful means if possible, though he did not discount violence or war if it proved necessary. Though McDonough did not play a pivotal role in the planning of the rebellion, it's thought that he contributed to the content and wording of the proclamation. At any rate, as one of the Dublin commandants based at the Jacob Biscuit Factory, his contribution was deemed serious enough for him to be condemned to death by firing squad. He died on May 3rd and was survived by his wife Muriel and his 2 children. Patrick Pierce was born on Great Brunswick Street, later renamed Pierce Street in his honor, in Dublin. He was schooled by the Christian Brothers and eventually won a scholarship to study law at University College in Dublin. After graduating in 1901, he was called to the bar. From an early age, he was fascinated by Irish culture and language. In 1895, he became a member of the Gaelic League, joining its executive committee in 1898. In pursuit of his dream of a free and Gaelic-speaking Ireland, in 1908, he established St. Enda's, a boys' bilingual school initially located in Dublin and later in Rathfarnham. To begin with, Pierce supported Home Rule, but his outlook became more radical over time. And by 1913, when the Irish Volunteers were formed, he was voted onto the leadership committee and would later take on the role of director. In the summer of 1914, he was instrumental in the smuggling of guns and ammunition by a Howth in County Dublin, which were stockpiled at St. Enda's. During the Rising, Pierce was positioned at the GPO. He was also the main author of the Proclamation of Independence. He was executed on May 3rd, 1916. As he faced death, he held a crucifix in his hand. Eamon Kent was born Edward Thomas Kent in Ballymoe, County Galway. He was educated by the Christian Brothers and latterly at the University College in Dublin in 1900. And as a fluent Irish speaker, he signed up with the Gaelic League, where he was introduced to Patrick Pierce. It was around this time that he decided to adopt the Irish form as the given name. In 1907, he joined Sinn Féin, and in 1912, he joined the ranks of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, in 1913 being voted onto the Provisional Committee of the Irish Volunteers, where he worked tirelessly to raise funds to buy arms. During the Easter Rising, he was based at the South Dublin Union, where it said he maintained a calmly brave stance right up until the point of surrender, even as the battle raged around the city. As one of the signatories of the proclamation, he must have known of the fate that awaited him at Kilmainham jail. And following the Easter Rising, along with the other signatories of the proclamation, Kent was sent to face the Kilmainham jail firing squad on the 8th of May, 1916. He left a wife, Anya, who was known for founding the White Cross, which was set up to help families disadvantaged by war. James Connolly was the son of Irish immigrant parents and was born in Edinburgh in extremely impoverished circumstances. It's thought that his passion for nationalism was inspired by his uncle, and he also devoured socialist writings and was influenced by Karl Marx in particular. At the age of 14, desperate to escape the poverty of his upbringing, he falsified documents that enabled him to enlist in the British Army and was subsequently posted to Ireland, initially to Cork and later to Kildare. He returned to Scotland briefly after he married his wife Lily, and economic necessity meant they also spent a great deal of time in America just after the turn of the century. But no matter where in the world he lived, his interest in Irish politics continued to grow. He finally returned to Dublin to live in 1910. Connolly co-founded the Irish Labour Party in 1912, worked hard to unite his Protestant and Catholic colleagues to speak out for workers' rights against the background of the strikes called by the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. In 1913, he played a pivotal role in the establishment of the Citizens' Army and was loudly critical of what he saw as the inactivity of the Irish Volunteers. During the Rising, he played the key role of Commandant General at the General Post Office. He was very badly wounded during the siege, and despite only having days left to live, was still subjected to an execution order. Unable to walk to where the firing squad awaited, he was instead carried there on a stretcher, and he was tied to a chair and summarily shot. Joseph Plunkett was born in Dublin into a very influential family. His father was a papal count. He was a gifted writer and was tutored by his fellow rebel Thomas MacDonagh while he was preparing to sit his exams to get into University College, where he would eventually graduate in 1909. They bonded over their shared interests of mysticism, religion, and poetry. When Plunkett was a young man, he contracted tuberculosis. And between 1910 and 1912, he spent time overseas in Egypt, Algeria, and Italy to try and relieve his symptoms. Back in Ireland, he was editor of the Irish Review. He was instrumental in establishing the Irish National Theatre. He supported Sinn Féin and took the workers' part during the infamous lockout of 1913. In the same year, he was voted onto the Provisional Committee of the Irish Volunteers and subsequently joined the IRB, where he was a vocal supporter of armed revolution. In 1915, he traveled to Germany to assist in the procurement of arms for use during the Easter Rebellion. On the 19th of April, McDermott and Plunkett released a document that is widely believed they partially forged, which appeared to emanate from Dublin Castle, and seemed to indicate that a crackdown on nationalism in the Irish Volunteers was imminent. This document was instrumental in the timing of the rebellion. Plunkett helped to plan the insurrection's military strategy and was the youngest man to sign the proclamation. Despite his ill health, he took his place at the GPO during the Rising and was condemned to die by firing squad for the part he had played. The night before he died, he married his sweetheart, Grace Gifford, in the chapel of Kilmainham Jail. These 7 men declared the establishment of the Irish Republic on Easter Monday. They are the signatories, but by no means the only pivotal figures in that insurrection. And if you read these beautiful hangings that were put up by a workhorse, a total force of workers who we hired to come in and bring these in. They mentioned a lot of the other people who also should be recognized, but the signatories are the ones who really put their lives on the line. So you'll notice 2 things about these gentlemen. Now, one of them had a military background, which played a major part in their defeat. And they were all executed by firing squad, which ironically gave them their ultimate victory. Led by Patrick Pearse, somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 Irish volunteers and 200 members of the Irish Citizen Army seized the Dublin General Post Office and other strategic positions throughout the capital and held out valiantly for 5 days against vastly superior forces, surrendering at the end but succeeding in spreading the Irish Republican concept to the general public, making a split from England not only possible but inevitable. The third Home Rule Bill had been introduced in 1912, sparking the Home Rule crisis. Although nationalists who were in a majority in the country supported Home Rule, the Protestant Unionists opposed it, since it would mean they would be ruled by a Catholic-dominated Irish government. To prevent Home Rule, in January 1913, they formed the Ulster Volunteer Force, the first paramilitary group of 20th century Ireland. And from there, the paramilitary rosters got very crowded. In response to the UVF, Irish nationalists formed a rival paramilitary group, the Irish Volunteers, in 1913. Within the Irish Volunteers, but largely following their own agenda, the Irish Republican Brotherhood was the driving force and attempted to control the volunteers. The overall volunteer leader was Owen McNeill, who was not an RIB member. The Irish Volunteers' stated goal was secure and maintain the rights and liberties common to all the people of Ireland, and it included people with a range of political views and was open to all able-bodied Irishmen without distinction of creed, politics, or social group. Another militant group, the Irish Citizens Army, was formed by trade unions as a result of the Dublin lockout of that year. And also in the mix with Sinn Féin, translated as Ourselves Alone, founded by Arthur Griffith in 1907. At that time, Sinn Féin was a small splinter political group, but would eventually become the main political arm for the Republican movement. We need to recognize that there was these various organizations, many of whom were at cross purposes because the failure to coordinate between these factories, largely due to the fact that they had different agendas, played a role in the insurrection's failure. As expected, all of these groups were not treated the same by the British. When the Irish Volunteers smuggled rifles into Dublin, the British Army attempted to stop them by firing into a crowd of civilians. Yet these same British Army officers threatened to resign if they were ordered to take any action against the Unionist UVF. So by 1914, Ireland seemed to be on the brink of civil war. Then came World War I, or WWI, as we call it. The Home Rule Bill was enacted, but its implementation was postponed by a suspensory act until the end of the war. The growing likelihood of enforced conscription created a backlash. The British government began suggesting that it will only implement Home Rule in exchange for Irish conscription. The responsibility for the planning of a rising was given to Tom Clark and Sean McDermott. The Irish Volunteers held a convention on October 24th, 1914, just over a month after the British government had declared war on Germany. At this meeting, they decided to stage an uprising before the war ended and to secure help from Germany. The Irish Volunteers set up a headquarters staff that included Patrick Pearse as Director of Military Organization, Joseph Plunkett as Director of Military Operations, and Tom McDonough as Director of Training. Eamon Kent was later added as Director of Communications. Now, the one thing you'll notice that while military is in their titles, it's not in any of their backgrounds. And almost all the military council was also held by people with zero military experience of any kind. At the meeting, it was decided they would maintain an armed and trained military volunteer force. They would resist partition. They would end British rule in Ireland and resist the enlistment of Irishmen into the British Army. At this time, the Irish Republican Brotherhood has considerable influence within the Irish Volunteers, and although they were part of the same organization, they were often at cross purposes which would have disastrous consequences. Under the theory that England's difficulty was Ireland's opportunity, the IRB began to plan the rising. But the non-IRB volunteers were unaware of plans for the rising, because by this time the military council was almost totally autonomous. The general plan was as follows. The IRB set Easter Sunday, 1916 as the date for the rising. Roger Casement traveled to Germany to secure weapons. Germany sent 20,000 guns on a ship called the Odd, operating within the belief that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. One of the key elements of the rising involved getting arms and manpower from Germany. Now, those who study the history of Anglo-Irish conflicts are aware of the pattern of English overreaction to Irish issues. But in this case, it was a different situation. The Easter Rising can't be viewed in a vacuum. You need to remember this was 1916. England was by this time at war with Germany. So when you hear that Germany was shipping arms and soldiers to a country less than 200 miles from England, that puts things in a different perspective. And the threat becomes more than just speculative. On the early hours of April 21st, 1916, Good Friday, 2 days before the rising was to begin, a German U-boat landed on Bannostrand in County Kerry, dropping off Roger Casement, Daniel Julian Bailey, and Robert Monteith. Casement had been involved in an attempt to land arms for the Irish Republicans from the German vessel, the Odd. The ship itself has an interesting history. Originally a British ship named the SS Castro, it was captured by the Imperial German Navy at the beginning of World War I and renamed Libau. Masquerading as the SS Odd, a similar-looking Norwegian vessel, the ship set sail from the Baltic port of Lubeck for the southwest coast of Ireland, carrying an estimated 20,000 rifles, 1 million rounds of ammunition, 10 machine guns, and explosives. After surviving violent storms off Rockall, Libau arrived in Tralee Bay on Holy Thursday, April 20th, where they were due to meet with Roger Casement. But because they had no radio on board the ship, they were unaware that the Kerry volunteers had been told to meet the ship on Easter Sunday off Fennet Pier. On Good Friday, April 21st, the Libau was approached by 3 British destroyers and attempted to leave the area but was cornered. The German crew then scuttled the ship to keep the weapons from falling to British hands. Casement was discovered and arrested on charges of treason, sabotage, and espionage against the Crown. He was taken straight to the Tower of London where he was imprisoned, and 4 months later he was tried and hanged as a traitor by the British government. But before he was captured, he managed to send word to Dublin about the inadequate German assistance. As it turned out, the plan, like so much of the Rising, was doomed from the start. One of the 2 carloads of volunteers that was supposed to meet the ship to unload it had crashed into the river Lahn many miles away, killing 3 of the 4 occupants of the car. So it turns out there had never been a possibility of an organized transfer of arms. As I mentioned, there was 3 men who landed on Bannostrand from the U-boat. Monument for Casement and Robert Monteith stands near the dunes with the inscription, "At a spot on Banna Beach adjacent to here, Roger Casement, humanitarian and Irish revolutionary leader, Robert Monteith, and a 3rd man came ashore from a German submarine on Good Friday morning, April 21st, 1916, in furthering the cause of Irish freedom." Now, that monument was erected in 1966 to commemorate the anniversary of the uprising. But you will notice, as I mentioned, there were 3 men on board, and it was voted to deliberately omit the 3rd man on the monument because at his capture he committed the ultimate sin for an Irishman. He turned king's evidence. So you see that much of the success of the insurrection was based on 2 things that were not going to happen: a major uprising by the Irish populace and assistance, arms, and manpower from Germany. In addition, few of the rebels had military experience, and this proved to be costly at sites like St. Stephen's Green, where the insurgents inadvisedly dug trenches. Remember, World War I was largely trench warfare, but unfortunately, St. Stephen's Green was overlooked by high buildings, and the trenches merely made easy targets for British sharpshooters placed on the roofs of the buildings. And finally, as is all too often in the case of Irish history, disagreements among the various rebel factions reduced their forces to numbers far too few to successfully defend the positions that they had taken. And while most of the IRB were for the rising, Volunteer Chief of Staff Owen McNeill supported a rising only if the British government attempted to suppress the volunteers or introduce conscription, and if such a rising had some chance of success. Now, of course, it stood no chance for success, so the full force of the volunteers would never take part. As mentioned, McNeill was not supportive of the rising. Then a document surfaced which became known as the Castle Document, which outlined British plans to arrest the leaders of the revolutionaries and occupy various locations where the various groups would meet. After the emergence of this document, McNeill had no choice but to join in preparations. Unfortunately, the document is believed to have been a forgery created by his fellow rebels, meant to have the effect of forcing McNeill into supporting the rising. And ironically, when McNeill came to realize the document was fake, it further doomed the rebels' cause. So Pierce issued orders in early April for 3 days of parades and maneuvers throughout Dublin by the volunteers for Easter Sunday, expecting them to understand what was meant by those coded orders. However, Irish Volunteer Chief of Staff McNeill, who had been against the rising from the onset, had come to the conclusion that the British were not, in fact, planning immediate action against the volunteers. And he issued a countermand to all volunteers, canceling all actions for Sunday, while he learned that the ship carrying the promised weapons had been scuttled. But this didn't cancel the rising. It only succeeded in putting it off for a day. His leaders went ahead with the rebellion, rescheduling it for Easter Monday. But what it did accomplish was that it greatly reduced the number of volunteers who turned out. The rebels did have the advantage of Easter Monday being a bank holiday, which meant many of the soldiers who ordinarily would be guarding the key sites were off duty. As a result, the insurgents were able to occupy many of the positions that they had earmarked with surprising ease. The Volunteers Dublin Division was organized into 4 battalions, although as a result of the countermanding order, all of them saw a far smaller turnout than originally planned. The 1st Battalion, which you see up there, was to occupy areas in the northwest to guard against attack from the west, while the 2nd Battalion, comprising about 200 men, gathered at St. Stephen's Green with orders to take Jacob's Biscuit Factory and other sites in the area before heading to the GPO. Eamon de Valera's 130 men of the 3rd Battalion were to take Boland's Bakery. Not sure why the rebels are so concerned with baked goods, but they are. And a number of surrounding buildings that cover the main road and the railway from Harbour at Dunleary. The 4th Battalion, numbering about 100 men, was to occupy the workhouse known as the South Dublin Union to the southwest, and again defend against attack from that direction. Various other smaller units were dispatched to other sites, although when you look at the numbers, how much smaller they could have been barely makes them a battalion. The remainder occupied the General Post Office, which was the headquarters battalion, and included 5 members of the Military Council: Pierce, James Connolly, Thomas Clark, Sean McDermott, and Joseph Plunkett. The headquarters battalion, led by Connolly, charged the GPO, allowed the customers and staff to leave, and took a number of British soldiers prisoner. 2 flags were hoisted on flagpoles on either end of the GPO roof: the tricolor and a green flag bearing the inscription Irish Republic. A short time later, Pierce led the proclamation of the Republic outside the GPO. Despite being caught off guard, the British forces recovered quickly and began to exploit their overwhelming advantage in manpower and firearms. In the beginning, the British authorities had approximately 400 troops to about 1,000 Irish rebels when the uprising began. By that Friday, British troops had risen to about 19,000, while the Irish Republican groups had only grown to 1,600 fighters. A detachment of British troops was sent to Sackville Street to investigate the situation at the GPO, and troops were sent to relieve Dublin Castle. Reinforcements were requested from nearby barracks and from England. As battles broke out throughout the various rebel-occupied sites, the superior numbers and firepower of the British gradually took their toll on the Irish forces. The insurgents were in command of the city for less than a day. City Hall was taken on Tuesday morning. The rebel position at St. Stephen's Green was made impossible to hold after the British placed snipers and machine guns in the Shelburne Hotel and surrounding buildings. Meanwhile, British field artillery pounded positions throughout the capital, reducing much of the city to rubble. On Wednesday, the guns shelled Liberty Hall and then began firing at the rebel positions on O'Connell Street. Heavy fighting occurred at the rebel held positions around the Grand Canal as British reinforcements advanced toward Dublin, while the volunteers inflicted heavy losses on British troops trying to advance toward Dublin Castle. They were unable to stop the advance. After days of shelling, the rebels at the GPO were forced to abandon their headquarters when fire caused by the shells spread throughout the building. And this was pretty clever, I thought, but they never give credit for whose idea it was. They tunneled through the walls of the neighboring building and took up a new position in the other building. But on Saturday, April 29th, realizing they could not break out of this position without further casualties, Pierce issued an order for all companies to surrender. One interesting side note, the rebels were responsible for the world's first ever radio broadcast. In 1916, wireless communication was in its infancy, and in general, signals were targeted to particular receiving stations. The idea that a signal might be just broadcast into the atmosphere in the hopes that someone might pick it up was a fairly radical one. On Easter Monday, however, rebel leader Joseph Plunkett sent 7 men from the GPO across O'Connell Street to occupy the Dublin Wireless School of Telegraphy. The school had been shut down and sealed by the authorities at the start of the war, and the equipment was dismantled. By Tuesday morning, however, the rebels had managed to get a damaged transmitter working, and they began to send out overly optimistic messages in Morse code, saying, "Irish Republic declared in Dublin today. Irish troops have captured city and are in full possession. Enemy cannot move in city. The whole country rising." From then until the building had to be abandoned under machine gun and sniper fire the next day, this message was broadcast at regular intervals, and this is widely accepted as being the world's first radio broadcast. And although it was indeed intercepted by several receivers, the rebels never knew if their message was being picked up because they couldn't get any of the receiving equipment to work. And of course, the actual situation was not quite as rosy as the broadcast would success. During the week of hostilities, 500 people were killed and 2,500 wounded. But while the loss of human life was significant, one party was protected. As mentioned, one of the first acts by the Irish Citizen Army in the Rising was to occupy St. Stephen's Green. However, with so many large buildings overlooking the green, including the Shelburne Hotel, and not enough men to occupy a useful number of them, the rebel position rapidly became untenable. British forces, particularly from the Shelburne, swept the green with gunfire, and the rebels were forced to withdraw to the College of Surgeons. However, things weren't so bad for one group of inhabitants. The war recorded that St. Stephen's Green had a population of ducks, and the park keeper named James Kearney would enter the green every day to feed the ducks. And every day the opposing sides would cease firing to allow him to do so. You also notice there was no fighting done in the Guinness Brewery for reasons we can well understand. And let's toast that decision while we're here. From Easter 16 by William Butler Yeats. I have met them at close of day, coming with wild, vivid faces from counters or desks among gray 18th century houses. I have passed with a nod of the head, or polite, meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite, meaningless words. And I thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where Motley is born. All changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.
Easter 1916 by W.B. Yeats. I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces.
That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument, until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers when young and beautiful she rode to harriers? This man had kept a school and rode our winged horse. The other, his helper and friend, was coming into his force. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. This other man I had dreamed, a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart. Yet I number him in the song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Hearts with one purpose alone through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone, to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud. Minute by minute they change, a shadow of cloud on the stream, changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim, and a horse splashes within it. The long-legged moorhens dive, and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stone's in the midst of it all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. Our part, to murmur name upon name, as a mother names her child, when sleep at last is come on limbs that had run wild. Was it by nightfall? No, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is said and done. We know their dream enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse, MacDonough and McBride, and Connolly and Pierce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Now, understanding this poem is crucial to understand much of what followed the insurrection. Yeats describes the rebels as he passed them on the streets or in parlors, remembering how he and the rebels had exchanged pleasantries on the street or talked at the club. Before the rising, they were just ordinary people who worked in schools, shops, and offices. And that's what we always have to remind ourselves. They were not soldiers. They were not trained military. They were not heroes from some ancient Irish epic. They were normal people, the kind you would strike up conversation with at a dinner party. Sometimes objects of mockery, good-natured as it may have been. But now, because of the insurrection, they are changed utterly. They have attained a gravity and an importance that he and the country did not see or recognize before. Yates remembers that woman, his childhood friend Constance Markovich, the Irish language teacher Padraig Pearse, who kept a school called St. Enda's, the poet Thomas MacDonagh, helper and friend to Pearse, and even Yeats' own rival in love, John McBride, who he describes as a drunken, vainglorious lout. McBride was married to Maud Gunn, a woman who Yeats was deeply in love with throughout his life. John McBride was accused of physically abusing her. So although Yeats clearly hated McBride, he realizes that he needs to be included into the narrative as one of those who died fighting. These ordinary men and women went from being considered almost worthy of mockery to being considered almost mythical figures as a result of their actions. And Yeats' change in attitude toward the rebels was reflected in the attitudes of the general populace. We read all the time that the rebellion was unpopular with the Irish people themselves until after the leaders were executed. But we must at all times remember that history is written by the victors. And I mean, it's true that many of the inhabitants of the city itself were dismayed by the destruction of their city. But recent accounts have emerged that cast serious doubt as to the claim that they were indifferent or negatively opposed to the insurrection. And it's clear that many of the civilians supported the rising, even if they did it in typical Irish fashion. Irish novelist James Stephens, who lived through the insurrection, wrote that one woman, when a wagon carrying troops was shelled, killing numerous troops, cried, "Oh, not the horses too." Even among those who did not support the rising, however, the executions of the leaders caused widespread disgust and outrage. And after the harsh measures taken against insurgents, the Sinn Féin separatist movement began to eclipse the Irish Parliamentary Party, heralding the beginning of the end of British power in Ireland. 15 of the rebellion's leaders were tried and executed. John Connolly was so seriously injured he had to be tied to a chair to be shot. One of the few who were not executed was spared largely because she was a woman, the Countess Markovich, who, in typical Countess Markovich fashion, that made her extremely angry, since she believed rightly that she had played as great a role as any of the men involved. Her response when she learned she would be spared: "I do wish your lot had the decency to shoot me." Another who was spared and went on to become the most prominent political figure in Irish history was, of course, Eamon de Valera. It's often claimed that he was spared because he was a U.S. citizen. But the fact is, his escaping execution was more a matter of luck than anything else. Because his post was the most removed from the action, he received notice of Pearse's surrender much later than the other commanders, and therefore was arrested later. As a result, he was farther down on the list of scheduled executions. By the time his scheduled execution date arrived, the British had already seen the worldwide reaction and had suspended further executions. Because of this, de Valera was able to parlay the fact that he was the only survivor of the leaders of the insurrection into political success. But his supporters and his detractors had differing views of his role in the insurrection. His supporters claimed he showed leadership skills and meticulous ability for planning. But his detractors, of whom he had many, claimed he suffered a nervous breakdown during the rising. According to first-hand accounts from 1916, de Valera was seen running about, giving conflicting orders, refusing to sleep, and on one occasion, having forgotten the password, almost getting himself shot in the dark by his own men. According to one account, de Valera, on being forced to sleep by one subordinate, who promised to sit beside him and wake him if he was needed, suddenly woke up, his eyes wild, screaming, Set fire into the railway. Set fire into the railway. Another of the leaders, Joseph Plunkett, was engaged to be married to Grace Gifford. Having no knowledge of the plans for the Easter rising, Grace planned to marry Joseph on Easter Sunday of that year in University Chapel on St. Stephen's Green, in a double wedding with his sister and her fiancé. Her parents were not in favor of her marrying Plunkett due to the precarious state of his health, because he was extremely ill at this time. Well, obviously the wedding didn't come off. Joseph survived the rising, but was sentenced to be executed on May 4th. Grace learned that Joseph was due to be shot. She bought a wedding ring and jeweler's shop in Dublin Center. She and Joseph were married on the night of May 3rd in the chapel of Kilmainham jail, only a few hours before he was executed. It said she heard the shots from the prison as she walked away. Whatever else the insurrection may have accomplished, if nothing else, it did give us one of the most beloved songs in the Irish music canon, written by brothers Frank and Sean O'Mara, the beloved song, Grace.
As we gather in the chapel here in old Kilmainham jail, I think about these past few weeks. Oh, will they say we failed? From our school days, they have told us we must yearn for liberty. Yet all I want in this dark place is to have you here with me. Oh, Grace, just hold me in your arms and let this moment linger. They take me out to dawn and I will die. With all my love, I place this wedding ring upon your finger. There won't be time to share our love, for we must say goodbye. Now I know it's hard for you, my love, to ever understand the love I bear for these brave men, my love for this dear land. But when Corrie called me to his side down in the GPO, I had to leave my own sick bed. To him I had to go. Sing it with me if you know it. Oh, Grace, just hold me in your arms and let this moment linger. You take me out to dawn, I will die. With all my love, I place this wedding ring upon your finger. There won't be time to share our love, for we must say goodbye. Now
There is another verse I advise you to check it out. It's a beautiful song, and I would be the last person to put a cynical spin on a lovely romantic story like that. But Michael Connolly, who was in charge of the IRA's finances, had the idea that they should be treated like a regular army, including with pensions for the soldiers and their families. The key word being their families, not their fiancés. So it's believed by some cynical sorts that Grace insisted on the marriage the night before the execution so that she could get his pension for the rest of her life. Whether it's true or not, Michael Collins did say she was always the first in line when they were handing out the pension checks. But I prefer to go with the romantic version. Because, hey, that's what I am. It didn't call for that much laughter. Incidents like these executions caused a wave of revulsion amongst Irish people who had previously had little interest in the rebellion. And we talk about the political implications of the proclamation itself, but in addition, it was one of the most socially progressive documents of its time. The proclamation is the only one of its era to mention equal rights. It begins with the words, "The Irish Republic is entitled to, and hereby claims, the allegiance of every Irishman and every Irish woman. The Republic guarantees religious and civil liberties, equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens." So it not only proclaimed Ireland's independence from the UK, but also made several promises that were groundbreaking at the time, including a commitment to universal suffrage that was practiced in only a handful of countries at this time, not including Britain and not including the US. He promised a provisional government representative of the whole people of Ireland and elected by the suffrages of all men and women. And keep in mind that the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, declaring for the first time that women, like men, deserve all the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, was not ratified until August 18th, 1920. In addition to the executions, more than 3,000 people suspected of supporting the uprising, directly or indirectly, were arrested. Over 1,800 were sent to England and imprisoned there without trial. 170 of the rebels were court-martialed, and 90 were sentenced to be executed. 15 of the leaders were executed. The rushed executions, the mass arrests, and the imposition of martial law, which remained in effect through the fall of 1916, fueled public resentment toward the British and were among the factors that helped build support for the rebels and the movement for Irish independence. Public opinion began to galvanize around the rebels. The cry for independence grew when it reached beyond a few rebel extremists. In the 1918 general election to the Parliament of the United Kingdom, Sinn Féin members won the majority of the Irish seats, but they refused to sit in the UK Parliament. And in January 1919, met in Dublin to convene their own parliament and declare Ireland's independence. The Irish Republican Army then launched a guerrilla war against the British government and its forces in Ireland. Finally, in 1921, the two sides signed a treaty that calls for the establishment of the Irish Free State. Ireland's 6 northern counties opted out of the Free State and remained with the United Kingdom. The fully independent Republic of Ireland, consisting of the 26 counties in the southern and western part of the island, was formally proclaimed on Easter Monday, April 18, 1949. So within 5 years of the rising, the rebels got what they wanted, an independent Ireland. Some of them, of course, never lived to see their life's ambition become a reality, but most of them knew long before the rising began that they had little chance of success, and they knew going in the price of failure. Imagine how they would have felt if someone had described the scenes 50 years later. In 1966, ceremonies were scheduled in all 32 counties, including those in Northern Ireland, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the insurrection. Memorial coins were minted for the occasion. Official ceremonies began on Easter Sunday, April 10th, with a military parade down Dublin's O'Connell Street, attended by some 600 veterans of the Rising. And in contrast to the feelings of the populace at the time of the original insurrection, approximately 200,000 spectators gathered in the city center for the celebration. And on that note, we will conclude our presentation. Thank you for listening. If you have questions, feel free to yell them out.
How come there were so many troops when World War I was going on? Just proximity to England?
Sure. Sure, they were, what, 300 miles away? The entire remaining British Army was 300 miles away. Plus, I mean, like I say, a lot of them, because it was a bank holiday, a lot of them had the day off, so it wasn't like, it wasn't like it was occupied like that when they took over the GPO. Has anyone seen the bullet holes in the pillars of the GPO in Dublin? Again, not one to cast aspersions of cynicism or anything, but I was told they're much later. They're not the actual bullet holes, but you do have to go and put your fingers in them. But yeah, the British were, I mean, and like I said earlier, they're in the middle of a war with a country that's looking to land manpower 200-300 miles away from them. They were prepared to take whatever action was necessary to quell this insurrection. You know, we always hear about they overreacted by killing young Kevin Barry and it turned the world against them. They overreacted with this other, you know, the 1798 rebellion, and it turned the world against them. But in this case, they had a legitimate fear. It was not it was not just a local rebellion in Dublin. It had the chance of having their main enemy in World War I being basically at their doorstep. You think of the shipment that was scuttled on the Odd. There was hundreds of thousands of guns, millions of rounds of ammunition. What there wasn't on there was manpower, which is what they really ended up needing. Yes,
Did the Irish pay for those guns, or they were donated by the Germans?
I'm sorry?
The guns, the 20,000
Well, I know
guns
I
and
know
rounds.
one of their main things was raising funds. A lot of what they were doing was raising funds in America too.
So the Germans got paid for those guns that ended up in the sea, or they donated them to the Irish cause?
Never said. I know Casement was negotiating with him.
Yeah.
So if he was gonna, if they were gonna donate it in Irish fashion, he would have said, okay, give me
It
more.
was a hell of a negotiations if you got them for free. God
As
bless.
far as I know, no one has done a deep sea expedition to try and find them either, so. You get that out of your head right now. Anything else? Thank you.